As the title, this meeting has been recorded. Got it, right, okay. As the title suggests there, I'll be covering files, formats, and finishing, bit of alliteration there, and how to prep print-ready greeting card artwork and add unique finishes. And in terms of the content, this is the agenda. I'll first of all give you a little background on Loxleys. Next on the list is file preparation, so considering card and envelope sizes, the initial stages of page makeup, and also image resolution and color. Following this, there'll be a section on finishes that can be applied to greeting cards, and here I'll explain how finishing can be added to your artwork. Following this is file supply, which covers recommended checks required before submitting artwork and creating print-ready PDFs. And then finally, post-webinar, there are next steps that can be taken where you will have the opportunity to send me your artwork. The file preparation steps here have sequenced in what I believe to be a logical order, as if a design was being built from scratch, from initial concepts to final artwork. And there's quite a lot to cover here in the space of an hour, so we'll not really have time for questions during the presentation. But if you do think of any questions during the webinar, please take note of them and we can follow up on those afterwards. I will also be making the slides used during this presentation available for future reference, so we can distribute those to all attendees. I'd also like to mention the GCA website and the file preparation page as seen here. This contains an overview of what we're about to see in this webinar, and I would encourage you to visit this site if you've not done so already. I'll be diving a little deeper into the sections that can be found here. Okay. So here we go, and I'll start with who are we and what do we do? Well, we are Loxleys Print Limited, a very long-established company based in Sheffield. The company was established by two brothers, William and Edward Loxley, way back in 1854. So next year will be our 170th anniversary. Loxleys started life as a stationers, bookseller and printers in the centre of Sheffield, next to the Sheffield Creameries, if you can see that in the image there. We moved to our current premises in 1921, which was originally a Victorian roller skating rink. And in 1980, the company first ventured into producing greeting cards, and by the mid-80s became well established as a greeting card manufacturer. We now focus solely on greeting cards and have become one of the UK's leading specialist greeting card manufacturers. We're still located in our iconic building just outside the centre of Sheffield, and we have established ourselves as the home of greeting cards. Our services include digital print, B1 litho print, a range of post-press finishes, as well as a range of packing options, all the way to final delivery. And I'll be covering a few of those finishing processes later in the webinar. And attending here today from Loxleys, we have Heather Bull, our marketing coordinator. We've got Tony Loriman, our managing director, and myself as the pre-production director. And pre-production for us encompasses the customer service department, IT, production components, and the pre-press studio, which is the part we'll be mainly concentrating on today. I myself have over 32 years experience in graphic reproduction and pre-press, man and boy. And I joined Loxleys back in 2001, so I now have 22 years worth of experience working with greeting cards. So on to file preparation. And before we even touch a keyboard, one of the first things we need to do is think about card and envelope sizes. So when you're starting to produce a range of cards or even a single design, the first important thing to consider is the size of the card. and the size of the card is usually determined by the envelope. It's quite possible to create a design at a slightly obscure, non-standard size, but sourcing an envelope will be made much more difficult. Common sizes that are produced in mass are cheaper and more available as a result. A lot of common sizes tend to be based roughly on old imperial measurements, which is the closed size of the card. And the table displayed here is just an example of a few of the more popular envelope sizes that are used. And you may find that the envelope sizes vary by a few millimeters depending on the supplier. Tony, in fact, has a list of stock envelope sizes and recommended card sizes for each, so that information can be available on request. And on the card sizes as seen here on this table are smaller than the envelope by between 5 and 7 millimeters for each dimension. Make the card any smaller and it will be too loose within the envelope. Any larger and you run the risk of it being a little too tight for the envelope or not fitting at all. So around 5 millimeters to 7 millimeters smaller is the norm. So once a card size has been determined, it's now time to start creating the artwork. And there are many different ways to do this and different software packages that can be used. By far the most popular in the industry is the Adobe Creative Suite, which contains the applications we can see here. So we've got InDesign, and InDesign is the go-to application when it comes to page makeup. It's capable of producing high-quality PDFs required for print production. It's also good for creating vector artwork, which includes shapes or anything else made from paths, including text handling. We've got Illustrator, which is mainly used to create vector artwork, so logos, text, patterns, or anything else that uses paths. But it can also be used for page makeup, and there are a few publishers out there that use it for that purpose. And for card work, that's absolutely fine. And Illustrator can also produce high-quality PDFs. Photoshop's main strength is image work and image manipulation. So please note that I've not added page makeup as a strength here. It's really not the best application to use for that purpose. In fact, I would strongly dissuade anyone from doing so. There are quite a few compromises if it is used solely to create a card and assemble artwork, and it may not produce the best quality artwork or even give you the best final results. And there'll be a little more on the reasons behind that later. And then we have Acrobat, which is mainly used to view PDFs. So I'll be concentrating mainly on InDesign when it comes to page makeup, which is the most popular option. And the very first stage is to create a new document. So documents are created using the open sides of the card. And the best way to visualize that is to actually open a card, which I hope you can see here. So we've got page 4 and page 1 on the front of the card, or the face of the card. And then we've got page 2 and page 3 on the reverse or the back of the card. And as an example there, I've selected a 9x6 card. So we have the size shown earlier, which is derived from the envelope. This is the closed size or the folded size. And what we need to do when creating a new document here is to set the trim size to the open size or the flat size, which in this case is 304 millimeters wide by 228 millimeters high. So if you look at the settings on the right there, we've got the width in millimeters and the height in millimeters. We've got 2 pages on this one. So what that means is we're creating the front of the card and the reverse of the card. Columns we can ignore, that's more for magazine work. And then we've got bleed and slug down at the bottom, and it's the bleed part of that which is important to us. So that is set at 3 millimeters on all edges, and that will give us a guide to use for bleed. And I'll come on to that right now. So true Blue Peter fashion, here's one I made earlier. There we go. So it's a 2-page document as mentioned. So we've got the face here with page 4 on the left and page 1 on the right. And then second page contains, it's the reverse of the card with page 2 on the left and page 3 on the right. Now, the first thing I would advise you do when setting up a document like this is to add a guide to show where the card will fold. So, which I've done here. So you need rulers active, which is Control R or Command R if you're on a Mac. And then you can drag a guide in place. You can try and position it manually, which is a little bit awkward. So the best thing usually to do is use the coordinates at the top. So I want that at 152 in this case, which will put it exactly in place. Also do the same on the reverse of the card as well, so you know where that's going to fold. And then the next thing to talk about is page bleed, which is something that's very important for print production. So I'll explain it using this edge here. If I just move this box out of the way. So what we can see there is the white area, which is the card itself. There's a faint purple line there, which hopefully you can see, which is the trim edge. So that's where the card will be cut to size. And then the grey area here is all the waste that gets cut away from the card. What we've added during the initial setup is a guide to show us where the bleed is, which is the red line there. So if I've got a print item such as this, and I stop it exactly where the card trims, that will give us problems in production. The reason for that is that when cards are trimmed in production, what we're talking about is high-speed manufacturing. We've got B1 sheets that are going through machines at high speed. We've got machine moving parts, lots of different tolerances at play. So we can't guarantee that the card is going to get cut exactly on that line right there. It's likely to move ever so slightly one way or the other. If it moves to the left, that's not really a problem because we're trimming off a little bit of print there. But if it moves to the right ever so slightly, it will be a problem because we've got a non-printed area of card showing on the front page of your card, which no one wants to see. So to guard against this, the best thing to do is if you've got any print item that's running up to the edge of the card, is to extend it beyond the edge of the card, as I've done there, into what we call the bleed area. So you can see now there, the purple line shows where the card trims, and we've got excess print going beyond it. So now, when the blade comes down, if it cuts ever so slightly to the right of the trim, it's not a problem because we've got print there to hide that fact. So page bleed is very, very important and should always be included in your document. The next thing to mention is wraparound, which is here. So this works pretty much, it's very similar to page bleed, except it's showing where it's print that extends over the fold of the card, and hopefully you can see that there on the camera, maybe not, but it's a very similar thing to page bleed. We don't want print to finish exactly on the fold line like that, because again, when the card's in production, it's unlikely to fold exactly on that line. It may go this way slightly, it may go that way slightly. So if it goes to the left a little too much, what we want to do is extend the print from page 1 into page 4 like that by around 1.5 millimeters. So again, if it folds ever so slightly to the left, it doesn't matter, you're still seeing the image from page 1. So it stops any artwork from page 4 appearing on page 1, which again, we don't want to see. So that is wraparound. Again, it's something that's quite important to make sure your card looks okay when it finishes. And you, again, similar to guides, you can try and move this into position manually, or you can use your coordinates at the top to get it exactly in place. The reverse of the card, same for page bleed. We want any print bleeding off the edges, but wraparound isn't really important on the reverse, so you can stop that exactly on the fold. So there we go, and it's much the same in Illustrator. Again, I've got an example of that here. So this is something created in Illustrator. Pretty much exactly the same. We've got page bleed, we've got wraparound. Only real differences, instead of pages, we've got artboards, but they work in pretty much the same way. It's on the slide now. And as you can see there, this is an image from the GCA website. It shows us exactly the same thing. We've got the trim line, we've got page bleed, and we've got the wraparound going over the fold. Okay, Photoshop. Photoshop is a little bit different, as I've already mentioned. If I create a new document here, it's 304 millimeters by 228. You can see now the next thing that I'm presented with is a resolution, and we'll come on to resolution a little later. But Photoshop documents are actually images that are based on a resolution. So in other words, made up of a grid of pixels. And you can also see there that there's no options for page bleed or margins or anything like that. So it's quite clear that Photoshop works differently to the design applications that are intended for creating pages. And also later on, something that Photoshop can't do is add tick marks to a document. I'll show you that a little later. Let's see. Back to the slides. And the next thing that I want to talk about is layers. And layers are something that are very useful and can help you construct your design. In fact, I'd recommend their use. Another quick example here in design. There we go. So I've created here the fundamental elements of a typical greeting card. We've got page 4 elements, we've got page 1 overall tin, an image area, a caption, and so on. So if I look at the layers panel, you can see I've split out all those little features into layers and named them accordingly. And that gives you quite a lot of control over the document. If you wanted to isolate one part of that design, you can turn off layers so you can see just what you want to see. You can lock layers, so you can add a little padlock against them there, and then you're not going to be accidentally moving things out of position. You can use it to arrange things on your document. So if I move the caption right to the very bottom, it's going to get hidden under another layer there. So I want that right at the top. So it's useful in that respect. And it just gives you a lot of control over the document. Much the same in Illustrator. You've got layers that you can use there as well. In fact, actually, one thing you can do is tab open a layer and lock elements within that layer as well. So it's all very useful. And whilst we're at this stage as well, I want to also mention creating templates. Templates, again, very useful if you want commonality across a range of cards. So once you've got a design constructed in this sort of way, and you've added all your logos, you've got your common text in place, your barcode areas, etc. One option you have is to save the artwork as a base template. So if I go to save as, it's an option there in design template. You can see I've made one earlier. So that will mean whenever you open that template to create a unique design, you've got a lot of the work's already done, things are already in place. And it also means that you're in no danger of accidentally overwriting an original copy or moving something midway through designing a range of cards. So it's quite a useful thing to create. I'll also mention fonts at this stage. So we have a font right there. So fonts can be used on your artwork, of course, can be purchased or downloaded from various sources. And they'll normally work fine within a document. It's not often we have fonts causing issues anymore, but it's not to say that it can't happen, especially if it's a free font that should have been paid for if used commercially. So for absolute peace of mind, one option you do have with any font is to convert it to outlines. And the way to do that is to select the font or the text, go to type, create outlines, and there's a very similar option in Illustrator as well. And if I do that, zoom in, you can see now it's made of paths, and it's no longer a font anymore, and it does give you the option of manipulating the text if that's something you wish to do. Okay. And there we have layers mentioned and templates mentioned. So now we have the basic structure of our design in place, we can start adding images. And if we're going to add non-vector images, we need to consider resolution. And what we really need to avoid if we want to produce a quality printed image is anything that is low res. And you can see on this slide the difference between a 300 dpi image on the left, which is the recommended resolution for print production, and a low-res image of 72 dpi on the right, which is a low-res image and the usual resolution for images used on websites. So to demonstrate this, I'm just going to create a circle in Photoshop at 2 different resolutions. So 50 millimeters by 50 millimeters, and I'll do this one at 300 dpi. So there we go. I've just created a circle in Photoshop at 300 dpi. I'll do exactly the same at 72 dpi. And if I flick between the two, you will be able to see the difference. 300 dpi gives us quite a smooth edge. Even if I zoom into it, you can see it's quite smooth. And we have to get quite close before we see the grid formation, which is quite a tight grid formation. 72 dpi, you can see the grid formation right there, and we've got quite a pixelated edge. So that would be kind of obvious if it was on any artwork that's going to be printed, you'd be able to see that rough edge. So resolution is basically describing the number of pixels in a grid at a certain size, which in this case is over a square inch, 72 versus 300. So for a printed image, we ideally need the resolution to be 300 dpi. But when considering resolution, the dimensions of the image are also important, as this can also affect resolution. So if I go back to my template here, this green area here is my image area. If I look at the coordinates at the top there, that's 156.5 millimeters by 120 millimeters. So say I had an image that is 300 dpi, but it's created at a smaller size of, in this case, 80 millimeters by 60 millimeters. I'll just drop that in. There we go. I've dragged and dropped that image in place, and we can see it's too small. It doesn't fill the frame. So what we can do is use various different methods of extending it, resizing it to fill the frame. You can use the percentage increase up here, 260%. There we go. It's filled the frame, and everything looks okay. So you would think that's a 300 dpi image. It's placed into the document. It should look okay, or so you'd think. Well, it's actually not, because if I zoom in, we can see a rough edge there. And the reason behind that is we've taken a 300 dpi image, we've taken that grid and we've extended it. We've stretched it beyond 200% in this case. So we've actually made those individual pixels bigger. So the DPI count per inch is not the same. And I can show you that via the information panel in InDesign here. If I select the image, it tells me here that the actual DPI or PPI is 300 DPI, but the effective DPI is 115. So that image now, because it's been enlarged, is actually low res. And this is something that can catch people out. We've on quite a few occasions warned a customer that the files contain low res images, only to be told that it can't be possible because all the artwork was created at 300 DPI, which it may well have been, but if it's been added to a document, enlarged in this sort of fashion, it's now become a low res image. So just be wary of that. It is something that can catch people out. Worth pointing out, actually, that the opposite can be true as well. If you start with a very, very large low-res image and scale it down, you're compressing that grid formation, so you can actually help the resolution if you're reducing image sizes. None of this applies to pure vector artwork. So by vector artwork, I mean anything that's used creating paths. Because vector artwork isn't based on a resolution. Paths are defined by a PostScript language, so these can be scaled endlessly within a picture frame without any image degradation. So the moral of the story is to always start with an image at the correct size. If anything, err on the larger size to avoid having to enlarge anything once it's placed into a document, and to check the effective resolution once it's placed. Resolution for finishing artwork is different. It ideally needs to be higher than 300 DPI, but I'll come on to that a little later. And don't worry if the effective resolution is higher than 300 DPI once it's placed, because that can be resolved when you create the PDF at the very end. I'll come on to that later. Just want to very quickly go back to Photoshop and open this 72 DPI image, as you can see there. Now, one thing you can do in Photoshop, if you're keeping the dimensions exactly the same, so in this case, I've got a 30 millimeter by 20 millimeter image at 72 DPI. One thing you can do is upscale the resolution, keeping the dimensions the same. So if I was to change that to 300, what Photoshop will do is create pixels where there were none. But what it has to do is guess what those pixels look like, and it uses these various resampling techniques here. Just leave it at automatic. So if I click OK there, you can see it's had a go to adding pixels to that image, but the result isn't always great. As we can see there, it's a little bit blurry and bumpy. But you know, it's had a good guess at what the pixels should look like. But essentially, really, if you start with a low-res image and you keep the dimensions the same, it's really always going to be a low-res image. You may be able to improve it a little bit, but probably not by much. Okay, that's resolution. And if you thought resolution was complicated, the next subject is color. It's a subject that can easily take an hour just by itself, so I'll try and keep this as brief as possible. So we'll start by explaining the difference between the RGB color space and the CMYK color space. Color spaces can work quite differently as these two do, and the way that colors are projected from your monitor is quite different to how colors are viewed when printed. Monitors, for example, emit light using red, green, and blue LED diodes as its primary colors. The diodes emit lights, and when all three are fully active and mixed, they produce white lights, and that's known as additive color. The diodes are very, very small and can't be seen individually by the naked eye, so when viewed at a normal distance, they give the effects of a certain color. So the RGB color space works well for images that are to be displayed on screens, such as images used on a web page. Printing mainly uses cyan, magenta, yellow, and black inks as its primary colors. Inks don't emit light. Instead, what they do is absorb light from another source and only reflect certain wavelengths back to our eye, which produces the color that we see. So that is known as subtractive color. In a very similar fashion to the diodes, it's small CMYK dots that are printed, which are normally not visible to the naked eye. And when they're viewed from a distance and mixed with the color of the paper used, or board in our case, the dots give the effect of a certain color. And the last image there just shows the available colors used in each of these color spaces. The range or the gamut of colors in the LAB space, which is the big one there, are all the colors that are visible to the human eye. And within this range, we can see the achievable colors that you can get from the RGB and the CMYK color space. So for printed artwork, it's important that you use the CMYK space whenever you're creating artwork. That will only then allow for colors that are achievable using CMYK inks. Because as you can see in the RGB color space, there are quite a few colors that can't be reproduced in the CMYK color space. So those colors cannot be printed. Okay. So when creating a document, you can please make sure that you choose the CMYK color mode. And I've got an example from Photoshop and Illustrator there. I'm not going to go deep into the very murky world of profiles here, but it's worth changing the Adobe color settings to Europe General Pre-Press 3 as the default settings are normally North American. And they can be found here in Edit Color Settings, and we want those at Europe General Purpose 3. Okay. You can actually do that from Adobe Bridge if you have that, and Bridge will then globally set that standard throughout all the applications. Okay, so as well as CMYK inks, we can add more printing inks to the mix by using Pantone inks, Pantone spot colors. And at Loxleys, we've got a 6-color litho press, which means that we can add 2 additional printing spot colors to a B1 sheet. So these are usually Pantone colors that can be found in a Pantone book. And the book in question is the Pantone formula guide that has a coated and an uncoated variant, as can be seen on the slide there. They contain Pantone references that can be produced as Pantone inks. Pantone seems to have a range of different books available now. I think they release a new one every week. So please make sure it's that formula guide that is used for print. Also, please bear in mind that if you do want to introduce spot colors to your artwork, it's 2 spot colors per B1 sheet that can be printed in one pass. You wouldn't be able to have 12 designs on a sheet with 12 different Pantone colors, for example, as the sheet would need to be passed through the press more than once, and that's not viable. Also, as it says on the slide there at Loxleys, Pantone colors can only be printed on litho sheets. The digital press that we have is 4-color CMYK only. So to add a spot Pantone color to your design, you're best to choose one from a Pantone book, as mentioned. Now, the Pantone books used to be available within the Adobe applications, and you could select what color you wanted to add to your palette. But they went after the 2023 updates due to a deal ending between Adobe and Pantone. So those swatches are no longer available. Instead, what Pantone want you to do is to purchase a license on subscription, which then enables access to the library. If you subscribe to Adobe's Creative Cloud, there is a workaround which will allow you to export the Pantone library from an older version of Illustrator and import it into the newer versions. It's too long to go into detail right now, but if you do a quick search on YouTube, YouTube will show you how to do this. Alternatively, you can just create a new spot, swatch, and approximate the color. And as we can see in each of the examples there, when you create a swatch, it has to be a spot color. So if I go back to InDesign here, create a new color swatch. The color type has to be spots. I can call that Pantone 200 in this case. And then, as I said, just approximate the color, doesn't really matter. The fact that it's a spot color is the most important thing there. Then I can add that to my swatch palette. And it's very much the same in Illustrator, works in the same way. Photoshop, being Photoshop, is different to the other applications. So if I open an image in Photoshop, such as this. So what I want to do here is add a spot color to this image. In fact, what I want to do is make the stone there a neon Pantone color, Pantone 806. So I'm going to select that area that I want, and then go to the channels panel, which is there, and create a new spot color. So a new spot channel again. The word spots is there. Call it what it's meant to be. So in this case, it's Pantone 806. Again, the color doesn't really matter, so I can just approximate that. I'll leave the solidity at 0% for the moment. So if I create that, we've now created a spots Pantone channel to that image, a spot ink. But as we can see, if I turn that off, what it's currently doing is overprinting the CMYK image that was already there. So what we would get if that was printed is a mix of those inks in CMYK and the solid Pantone 806 over the top, which wouldn't really work because you'd lose the effect of the neon ink. So in this case, what we would need to do is get rid of the CMYK image, which is there. So now we've just got the Pantone color printing by itself without any CMYK inks underneath. So just bear in mind that if you do add any spot inks to your design, you sometimes may have to knock it out of the CMYK image. Okay. Once we have that image and we've saved it, it's just a matter of adding it to the InDesign document. like so. Okay. And as you can see, in doing so, the Pantone color is automatically imported into the swatch palette. So everything takes care of itself. It's sort of marked up as a little spot color, as you can see there. So we know that that's a printing spot color. So if you're using Photoshop, that's the way to add the spots ink. Okay, back to the slides. So when we use spot colors of any kind, I would strongly recommend that you use the separations preview panel, which in InDesign is the one on the left there. I'll show you where that is. This shows you all the separations that are used on the document, and it will show you how the spot color will print as well. So when creating a PDF from this document, in this case, we will have 5 separations, which is what we want. If it's not as expected, then you will need to amend the image in Photoshop or make any correction that's required. So the separations preview panel is one of the most useful features you can use, and I would highly recommend it. So just to show you what that looks like in this case. So it's Windows Output Separations Preview, which is there. If I turn that, switch that to separations, on this document, we can see we've got cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, and also the additional spot color. And we can control those by turning them off if you want to view them individually. So it's a very useful feature. Okay, and talking of spot colors, it nicely brings us onto the next section, which covers finishing. So here we go. So creating a card design that is printed, cut, and folded is absolutely fine, and there are many designs that just stop there. But if you want to further embellish your design, you have a number of options. And the most popular finishes are as follows. So we've got overall UV varnish, which adds a glossy finish to the front of the card, page 4 and page 1 of the card. To use on coated materials only, doesn't work on uncoated materials as it sinks in. There's nothing additional required on the artwork. It's typically an order instruction, and that's okay for litho and digital orders. Then we've got spot UV varnish, which is very similar, but it's applied to selected areas of the artwork for use on coated materials again only. That requires a spot separation on the artwork, which I will come to, and that's okay for litho, but not digital orders, and that's because it requires a special plate that's used on the litho press. And we've got flat foil, which is usually a shiny metallic finish to selected parts of the card. Foiled areas are flat to the card. A spot separation is required on the artwork for this, and that's okay for litho and digital orders. So I say it's usually shiny metallic or holographic foil, but not always. There are other options. There's transparent foils and matte foils. It can be applied to litho and digital orders, although the two methods work differently. For litho orders, they're produced on B1 sheets, and it's foil that is hot stamped onto the sheet via a heated metal die. Yeah, should be able to show you. There we go. And flat foil is usually a magnesium die and is usually chemically etched. Digital foil is different. It's usually an image area that's printed onto the card. It's then heated to make it tacky, and then a special kind of foil is rolled onto the card and stuck onto the ink. So there's no dyes involved. And because of the process, the digital foil can only be flat. Hot foil is by far more common, and for that reason, the range of foil shades for hot foil is far greater than it is for digital foil. Then we come to fluted foil. which again is usually a shiny metallic finish to selected parts of the card. But in this case, foil areas can be raised. Again, it's a spot separation that's required on the artwork. That's okay for litho, but not for digital orders, as I've just explained. So again, we'll probably not be able to see this too clearly on the camera, but we've got fluted foil here, and I have a fluted die here. It's much heavier because it's usually made from brass. And along with a fluted die, we have a counterforce. So it's essentially a mix of foil, flat foil and emboss, which I'll come to in a second. But the foiled areas of the card are pushed out and raised from the card via a die and a counterforce. The fluted die itself is usually made from brass, and it's produced on a CNC machine, so it's cut by quite fine tools that follow a 3D program. Counterforce is molded from the fluted areas of the die. The board sits in between the die and the force and is pushed into place. So as it uses a die, it has to use a die. It's only suitable for B1 litho orders. So then we come to emboss and deboss, both very similar as they, again, shape the card using a die and a counterforce. Emboss pushes the parts of the card out, and deboss pushes the card in. Emboss can be single level or multi-level, and what that means is single level will just be a raised area that is flat at the top, and that's usually made from a chemically etched die. Multi-level dies can have shapes within them and more detail, and can push the cards to different levels. And the die for that is, again, CNC machine using the 3D model. Deboss can only be single level. And that's, again, okay for litho orders, not digital orders. Die cuts, so that cut shapes or apertures into the card. Just think of that as a big pastry cutter, which is essentially what it is. There we go. So that stamps it stamps a shape into the board. Then we've got flitter and Verco. So flitter, otherwise known as glitter, which I'm sure everyone is aware of. At Loxleys, it can be applied to both litho and digital orders. It's a finish that's fallen out of favour over the past few years due to it mainly being a plastic product, although there are biodegradable options available now, and certain retailers have shied away from it. It's a thermographic process where varnish is applied to parts of the card. A flitter powder sticks to the varnish and is then heated, which produces the glitter. Verco is very similar, but it doesn't use the flitter particles, so you get raised areas on the card without the glitter. Okay. Things can get a little bit more complicated from a file point of view as soon as finishing is involved. And you may have seen against most of these, apart from the overall UV varnish, that we need a spot separation on the file. But the good news is that all the post-press finishes mentioned fundamentally follow the same rules, and they're created in a very similar way to adding the printing Pantone color as we've just seen. And these are the golden rules to follow when adding finishing artwork. It should always be a spot color, so very similar to adding spot color as I've just shown. It should be named relevant after the intended process, so emboss, die cut, etc. And it should be solid, not tinted. So you can't have 50% of the foil, for example. In addition, the following rules are recommended but not mandatory. So finishing artwork ideally should be set to overprint, and vector artwork is preferable for better results. If you're applying finishing artwork to your card, this one slide is very important, and I recommend you refer back to it if doing so. I'm going to show you an example now. So this here is based on a Christmas card that I did quite a few years ago for Loxleys. So I've used different methods of adding finishing to this InDesign document. We've got layers here, so I've layered it so I can access all the different parts of the design. We have die cut that's added to the design around the edge. Hopefully just see there, which rounds the corners. And I've done that in InDesign just by adding a rounded rectangle and giving it a spot color called die cut. It's colored as a spot color called die cut. So it's following the golden rules. We've got fluted foil there. The caption is a fluted foil there. If I edit the original, that's been made in Illustrator in this case, as a spot color, which it should be, gold fluted foil, spot color. And I've also set that to overprint. Emboss, really just for demo purposes, I've created emboss using Photoshop. So if I go to the image here we go. So this is the image of the two characters used on the card. I want them both to be embossed, so I'm going to add an emboss spot separation the same way as I did the spot separation earlier. So I can select areas of the card, create the spot channel, which we have right there. Now that's okay and acceptable, but please bear in mind that that has been created at 300 dpi, which is okay for print, but it's not really the recommended resolution for finishing, which is actually 1200 dpi. So there's a lot of customers that create finishing artwork in this sort of way at 300 dpi and are happy with the result. But when it comes to foil in particular, it's probably a little bit better if the image size was upped first to 1200 dpi and then the selections were made in the document. Looking at the time, I'm probably not going to have time to do that. So I'm going to have to skip this section and go back to my slide, which explains the old school bitmap method. So this is something we can follow up on if you're interested. But there is an alternative way of creating finishing via Photoshop, which is using this method. It was the only way at one point. And that's to first of all increase the image resolution to 1200 dpi before anything else is done, then create a new spot channel and select all the areas of the image required. And it just produces a really high quality, smooth bitmap image that can be then placed into your InDesign document. So the do's and don'ts of finishing, for flat foil and fluted foil, they can both be on the same die. If that's what you want, please add them as two separate spot colors on the artwork, one for flat, one for fluted. Likewise, multi-level emboss, we need one, if you're using different layers, for example, an area that's marked as the lower layer and another one for the higher level. Die cut artwork must be vector, can't be done via Photoshop because it tends to go to a CAD programmer who needs that artwork as vector, and follow the golden rules, which are on the previous slide. As far as the don'ts are concerned, layers are not spot separations. It always makes me twitch a little bit when people call them finishing layers. Layers I've already described, they're good for building a design, but spot separations are actually quite different. If you had a Photoshop document, created a layer in it, put some artwork in it, that is not a spot separation. Varnish cannot be applied to uncoated boards, as I've mentioned. Keep embossed areas away from the spine, as far away as possible, really, because it can interfere with the folding of the card. Avoid fine fluted foil and emboss artwork. The greater the surface area, the greater the result. So the card can only, if you've got a real fine area of emboss, the card can't really push out all that far because it will split. So if it's over a greater surface area, you've got more area that you can push out, and the result will be better. Avoid intricate die-cut shapes and small apertures. As I've said, it's basically a big pastry cutter with metal rules in, and the metal rules can only be bent to certain shapes. There can't be very fine points because the metal won't allow for that. And if you're ever in doubt, please send us the artwork and ask. What we'll do is contact our suppliers and find out if the finish is possible or not. So print-ready artwork checks is the next section. So we're presuming we've got everything correct now. We're happy with our design. These are the recommended checks that I suggest you do before submitting artwork to your supplier. Artwork supplied to suppliers really should be final and print ready. There are sometimes approval stages if you submit artwork. Then shouldn't really be used as an opportunity to completely redesign designs. You're there really just to make sure everything is the same as you supplied it. So this is a recommended checklist to go through prior to submitting any artwork. Check that the trim size is correct. Make sure you've got page bleed and wraparound added. Make sure your image resolutions are okay. Color modes are CMYK. Make sure that you've activated all your layers that you want to activate. Make sure that the separations and spot colors are okay using the separation preview panel. And the big one there, make sure the content is okay. Make sure that birthday and Christmas are spelled correctly. PDF settings really are there to refer to, and you'll get a slide with all these on. Once you've gone through all these settings, you can save them as a preset there, so you don't have to keep adding the same settings all the time. As it says there, please name the PDF the same as the SKU code or the item code, and try and avoid any other text on there, because all we'll have to do is trim it off and name it as per the item code. So we've got PDF settings there, and you can save that as a preset. Once your PDF's created, there are options when it comes to file transfer, and these tend to be the most popular methods. We've got an internet-based transfer service such as WeTransfer. There are storage facilities out there such as Dropbox, which can generate links to artwork. Or you've got, in our case, we've got Loxleys Insight, which is our internet-based file transfer system. And if that's used, files end up on our file server in the correct place and email notifications are sent out. So that brings us then to the very last part, which is sending us your artwork. So now you're armed with all that information, it's over to you. You can create some artwork, send us some artwork to check. If you send that to me, I can follow that up with a one-to-one session, either phone, email, or a video chat, and we can go through the file setup. Heather will also be in touch with all attendees, and we'll send you a copy of the slides that I've used here for future reference. And that is that. So the only thing left to say is thank you everyone for attending, and I hope you found it useful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, 4 minutes over. Not bad. Is that okay?
That was perfect. That was really
Good.
good.
Well, thank you.
Okay. I had to race through the last bit. Apologies